In the 1870s and 1880s, the Industrial Revolution was just beginning to take its hold, its effect. And artists at this time, at this period in history, were really engaged with salon painting and representational painting. And a lot of the work that was being produced at this time was being patronized by very wealthy clients. If you were an artist in the late 1800s, you were expected to paint portraits of wealthy nobles' daughters, of landscapes, perhaps maybe the American mountains, and maybe a fancy still life because a lot of patrons wanted this in their house. And a very expensive painting of a still life showed how rich you were. Around about this time, artists began to question what painting actually was. And around about the turn of the late 18th, 19th century, artists began to look at the picture plane in a different way. In Paris, which was the epicenter of this avant-garde art movement, artists were flocking to Paris, and they were trying to experiment and come up with new ways of painting. People were beginning to get very bored and quite upset with the late 18th century and 19th century ways of doing things. And with the turn of the century, a lot of artists began to push and experiment with their paintings. Artists like Claude Monet, Vincent van Gogh began pushing the picture plane using strokes and vibrant colors. Around about this time, artists began to create and develop new ways of seeing and doing. And a lot of different art movements began to pop up at this time, things like Impressionism, Expressionism, and so on. So, around about the year 1910, 1911, we see that World War One happens, and the whole world is practically fractured by this huge war that's happening. And for the very first time, we see the effects of the Industrial Revolution and how man begins to produce and create technologies against his fellow man. And there was many artists who lost their lives actually in this war. And the aftermath of this war was that the world's boundaries, its borders, and its nations were divided and reestablished into new empires and new countries. And after this happened, artists who were already tackling with different ways to make paintings, they found themselves in a very weird place. Many of them had hang-ups about what nationalism was. Many of them had hang-ups about what art was. Many of them began to question what art meant. And from this period in art history, something called modernism began to appear, early modernism. And this is when artists began to question their art practice and look at new ways of doing things that were completely avant-garde and new for the time. So I want to introduce early modernism and what modernism was. So modernism was a cultural movement from the late 19th to mid 20th century. It started off in the late 1880s and it culminated in the 1950s. So we have this massive portion of time where a lot of things are happening. And it's marked by the end of World War One, which happened in 1918. And from this we have the effects of the Industrial Revolution. We have things like the steam engine. We have things like the camera making their way into the lives of ordinary people. And modernism was almost a response to changes in Western society. A lot of the old established rules in empires began to fade, and people began to question the power and authority of these stakeholders in culture. As a result of this, artists in particular, they began to reject traditional forms and conventions, meaning that people became quite tired of painting noble lords and ladies and landscapes and still lifes. And many of them began to reevaluate these topics. Many of them began to look at their own societal lives. And in this period of art history, they emphasized experimentation and new ideas. So people were looking at, collage. They were looking at um, even ways of breaking up the image. And we see very early on artists like Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, um, and his contemporaries. They began to fragment and uh, use different methods of breaking the picture plane. They were no longer interested in mere representation of objects and of people. They became very interested in what could actually be done on the picture plane. So you can see Picasso began experimenting with this sort of cubist idea, and a lot of his ideas with this art were actually taken from African art. We know Pablo Picasso visited the museums of Paris, and in those exhibits there was African masks, and we can see in this painting that he's produced salon ladies. You can see their faces are very reminiscent of African masks, and the way that they're abstracted is quite telling of his influence. Artists like Henri Matisse, they began to visit North Africa and places like Morocco, and from there they started looking at the way in which the Moroccans created their art, how the Africans created their art, and how they used color as a form of expression and pattern as a way of expression. And all this is happening around 1900, 1911, 1913, right up to the end of the First World War. Right after the World War, artists honestly began to question what painting was. Was painting even art? And artists like Marcel Duchamp began to take objects that he had found or objects of interest and place them into gallery settings, effectively challenging what art meant. As I mentioned before, photography also made its way into the public discourse. Artists like Man Ray began to experiment with photography. And in a way, the camera also, the invention of the camera um, was a big deal. Um, Again, it began to question and poke at the artist's sensibility. That look, I have technology now that can capture wealthy lords and ladies and patrons of the art um, pretty much in exact detail. And the role of the artist began to take a backseat to mere representation. Other artists like Paul Klee, they started breaking up the picture frame um, with color and line. These paintings by Paul Klee, this painting Castle and Sun, Oil on Canvas, was painted in 1928. This is right after the end of the First World War, just 10 years after. And Paul Klee began to develop these paintings that are almost like tapestries. And we know this because Paul Klee actually began to look at the influence of the culture around him in Europe. He began to look at tapestries and illustrations and so forth. So all of this is happening in Europe, and it's very interesting how modernism seeped its way into the Indian subcontinent. Uh, in the 1900s, we know that the British were still occupying India, and their influence in India was very similar to how it was back home. They were training people to paint realistically. They were training people to paint figures and landscapes and still lifes. But something began to occur around about this time in the subcontinent, and the early modernists in India began to do the opposite of what was happening in Europe. Um, they actually began to reject Western influence, and rather than push towards abstract ways of dealing with the picture plane, they began to look at their own culture, and they began to look at the people around them as influence, as subject. And rather than abandon the methods in which they were trained in, which was predominantly European and British, they instead began to revitalize and revisit their own culture. So artists like Amrita Sher Gill, Rabindranath Tagore, A.R. Choktai, and others began to redefine and reshape the cultural arena of the Indian subcontinent. So if we look at this painting by Amrita Sher Gill, which was painted in 1935, uh, we can see its European method of handling the paint, but the subject matter is of something that's very local. And Amrita Shergill, who was actually a half Hungarian, half Indian painter. She frequently traveled to Paris and she met with many of the famous Impressionists and she came in contact with their work. And we know this because Amrita Shergill was greatly inspired by Paul Gauguin. And Paul Gauguin also began to look at uh, artists and art from other parts of the world and paint the natives of a particular island in the Pacific called Tahiti. And Amrita Shergill sort of riffs on this. She looks at her own people and wants to paint them in domestic settings. And Amrita Shergill was very famous for her paintings of South Asian women. So this is Amrita Shergill's solo exhibition. It was completely sold out. It was based in Folletti's Hotel in Lahore in 1937, and we can see the painting of the three girls behind. Here's Amrita herself. Okay, so artists like A. Tagore and A.R. Chaptai, they began to look at subject matter rather than new ways of creating an image. They began to look at the concept itself. So Tagore was very interested in, uh, you know, Indian nationalism and also India as a subject matter, Indian mythology in particular. And his paintings, while his eye and his hand are trained in a Western tradition, they began to paint uh, images of India and what India could be. So this painting on the left here, called Bharat Mata, was painted by Tagore in 1905. And if we contrast this with art that was being produced in Europe in the early 1900s, for example, Pablo Picasso's painting here, we can see there's a stark difference in how the figure is being treated. Tagore is more interested in the philosophical underpinnings of the picture plane, what the picture can actually portray, and how it portrays South Asians in particular. Whereas Picasso is more interested in how he can break up the figure, and it becomes more about what the picture is rather than what the picture says or what the picture is uh, philosophically influenced by. Very interesting. Another painter I want to introduce is Alabaksh. Alabaksh was trained as a Western style painter in Lahore, and his paintings were often of rural landscapes. You can see this painting from 1928 is a very realistic depiction of the Punjab landscape. And again, this was painted in 1928. If we contrast to what's happening in the 20s, this is Paul Klee's painting in 1928, and again, you can see the modernists in Europe were very interested in how the picture plane can be represented in different ways. Whereas Alabaksh is more interested in what he sees. Because before this, there were very few paintings of what was happening in the Indian subcontinent through the eyes of an indigenous person. Before, company paintings, especially British East India paintings, were mostly through the lens of British colonizers. And it was very difficult for artists to go out and portray what was happening at the time. We can see Allah Baksh's treatment of the landscape. It's very European, but the landscape itself is not European at all. It's proudly Punjabi. It's proudly from the subcontinent. Another one of the great painting series by Allah Baksh was his paintings of Krishna, and where he was living at the time in the Indian subcontinent in Lahore. Lahore was a thriving metropolitan, cosmopolitan city, and it had a very mixed population of Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Parsis, and Jains. And Allah Baksh made a name for himself by painting paintings of Krishna, and we can see how his treatment of the figure is very westernized. And there's a wonderful late 18th century almost style about his work. This looks like something that was painted much earlier in the 1800s. If we look at this painting on the right, we can actually compare it with paintings that are from that period. So you can see this wonderful standing figure of Krishna. He's leaning on what looks to be some kind of temple architecture. There is a figure, there's a landscape and a waterfall. But look at the way the figure is treated. It's very Western. If we contrast it with this late 18th century painting of a Scottish nobleman, we can see that there's huge similarities in the way in which the figure is uh, standing, the way in which it's posed, the way in which the hand is grabbing an object, how he's leaning on the surface, and how there's a background. And this is sort of the legacy of British influence on painting schools in the Indian subcontinent. The British were coming and they were teaching a lot of these Indian artists how to paint in the same style as they were. And this is actually the first time in the late 1900s where oil painting is a big deal, because oil paint did not exist in the Indian subcontinent prior to the British arrival. And so this is sort of the legacy that they're leaving, a legacy of canvas painting, a legacy of oil painting, of the stylization of figure, of the treatment of figure. But the early modernists at the time were trying to move away from this legacy. They were honestly tired of painting nobles, and they wanted to paint what was close to them, whether it be religious or sociocultural. Here's another painting by Allah Baksh. It was painted in the late 1900s, 1923. It's of a Punjabi folk story, Soni Mahiwal, and we can see this lamenting figure and a woman sort of floating down the river. And it's painted in this wonderful, again, European style, but it shows a native. It shows a Punjabi man with his mustache, his turban, his tunic. If we look very carefully at this painting, the subject matter is proudly subcontinent, from the subcontinent, from Punjab. But the way in which the figure is painted, the way in which the landscape is treated, even though it's South Asian, is very Western. And for those who are very privy of art history, can probably see the similarities between this painting and a Western painting of Ophelia by John Everett Millais, painted in 1851. And we know that painters at this time were being heavily influenced by British painters, of course. And they had access to these paintings, they had access to see these paintings via the British. The British came with a lot of these paintings to show. And many of these artists actually traveled to parts of Europe in order to train, and they came in contact with these paintings. So you can see that there's a striking similarity between this painting of Ophelia by the British painter John Everett Millais in 1851 and Allah Baksh's painting in 1923. It's quite fascinating to see the influence. All right, moving on. So towards the end of the late 1920s, early 1930s, war erupts, and it's a massive war that completely decimates the entire globe. World War II begins, and there's huge repercussions regarding art history. Effectively, art at this time comes to a complete standstill, and the world is split into two sides. So we have the Axis, which comprises of Japan, Italy, Germany, and the Allies, France, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And these powers battled it out for many years, for over 6 years. And the world as we know it at the time is completely decimated. The war ends in the early 1940s when the nuclear bomb is dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the literal devastation of this event effectively stops the war in its tracks. And the metaphorical repercussions of this bomb being dropped and destroying everything is that it destroys everything before it when it comes to art history. And the world begins to become split into different factions and different countries. Huge, vast empires completely dissolve, and new borders and new boundaries are formed. So we have countries like the Soviet Union splitting up into its parts. We have Europe, which was once a massive empire stemming from Spain all the way to the far western regions of Russia, splitting into Spain and France and Italy, and the smaller countries here like Romania and Hungary, and Britain becoming its own uh, huge empire. Uh, Over here at the top, we have Northwestern Europe, which again is splitting into Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, and all these countries in the global south. They're becoming their own as well. So, what happened after the war ended? There's this massive aftermath. Cities are completely destroyed. There's bomb sites. There's austerity. There's refugees. Rationing is becoming a big thing. People don't have enough food. There's a mixture of emotions. People are traumatized. There's a great deal of excitement and hope for the future. Artists, in particular, they're sort of figuring out what to do with this devastating event. So what happened then? There's this massive gap uh, in people and nations, and people are completely lost and confused. And all of these countries that were once the powerhouses of the art movement, like France and Spain and Italy, their power is completely lost. Because there's no cities left. France is completely destroyed. Berlin is completely destroyed. Parts of Spain is completely destroyed. And as a result, America begins to become this huge powerhouse in modern art. And a lot of these countries start sending refugees to this part of the world, to America. And a new post war modernism begins to develop because people are completely lost in what is to be done with the art world. And this sort of created the rise of an avant garde movement of art around the world, not just in America and Europe, but in India as well. And we know of these movements that happen, such as the American Abstract Expressionist movement. In Europe, we have the Lettrist movement and Art Brut. In Japan, we have Gutai. But what was happening here? We've just gone through this massive, globally traumatic event, and just a few years after, the partition happens, and India is completely split into two. United India is now split into Pakistan and India, and this traumatic event in the history of India creates this sort of new group of artists, uh, formerly under the name of the South Asian Avant-Garde, and they were the Lahore Art Circle and the Progressive Artist Group. Artists like Shakir Ali, Shemza, Feroz, Ahmed Parvez, and Ali Imam from Pakistan began to carve out new nationalist identities and new ways of creating art. And many of these artists at the time um, began to look at the pre-partition modernist era as being old and traditionalist, and still relying upon representation as a way in which to, firstly, portray an image, and secondly, to create a nationalist image. So a lot of these artists began again to look at new ways of doing things. And in India, we have the Progressive Artist Group comprising of H.F. Raza, F.N. D'Souza, Guy Dondi, all these wonderful artists, M.F. Hussain, Mayyad Tayyib, and so on. And on both parts of the subcontinent, there's this need for new things, for new art, and a new way of seeing things. And this sparks this great progressive movement of art in the post-partition. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. This was a relatively short lesson. It was just an introduction. Uh, In the next lesson, we're going to cover the major schools of art that were present pre and post partition, such as NCA Lahore, the Baroda School of Art, and the Bengal School. We're going to think about how art changed as a result of British colonial influence and how it developed after they had left. And then we're going to get stuck right into the Bombay Progressive Artist Group and the Lahore Art Circle.